Good day. I'm Dr. Mark Andrew Holochek, philosopher, historian, and Thomas Jefferson scholar, and today I'd like to talk to you about the Declaration of Independence. First, I'd like to give you just a little bit of background information about the Declaration. Then I'd like to walk you through the thread of Thomas Jefferson's rough draft of the Declaration, and last, have some comments from a belle lettres perspective of the value of the Declaration of Independence. Now, first off, one might ask, what was the purpose of the Declaration of Independence? Was it really a Declaration of Independence? And I think the rough consensus among scholars that it was not, that it was at least not a declaration insofar as it was the first document to proclaim American liberty from Britain. That was done by the Continental Congress on July 2, 1776, at the behest of Richard Henry Lee. Now, Jefferson gives his version of the purpose in a letter to Richard Henry Lee, roughly about a year before he dies in 1825. He says, when forced to resort to arms for redress, an appeal to the tribunal of the world was deemed proper for our justification. This was the object of the Declaration of Independence. Not to find out new principles or new arguments never before thought of, not merely to say new things which had never been said before, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject in terms so plain and so firm as to command their assent, and to justify ourselves in the independent stand we are compelled to take. Neither aiming at originality of principle nor sentiment, nor yet copied from any particular or previous writing, it was intended to be an expression of the American mind, and to give to that expression the proper tone and spirit called for by the occasion. All its authority rests then on the harmonizing sentiments of the day, whether expressed in conversation, in letters, printed essays, or in the elementary books of public rights such as Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, Sidney, and so forth. A very beautiful articulation of Jefferson's aim in writing the declarations, to try to sort of marshal together the harmonizing sentiments of the day and express the mood of the time when the founding fathers were trying to break away from Great Britain. Now I would like to take you through the thread of Jefferson's draft of the Declaration. He begins, and this is not the declaration that it comes down to us today. That was altered significantly by the Continental Congress after Jefferson submitted it to them, and Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and made some trifling comments, changes to Jefferson's document. So Jefferson begins. He says, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for people to advance from that subordination in which they have hitherto remained, and to assume among the powers of the earth the equal and independent station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind require that they should declare the causes which impel them to the change. So there's his opening salvo, and it iterates what Jefferson says in the letter to Richard Henry Lee, that we're sort of trying to harmonize the sentiments. And the audience is humanity itself, all human beings. We're trying to show why we're breaking away from Great Britain and that we are justified in doing so. Now, Jefferson understands that just saying, okay, we're breaking away, is not itself good enough. There needs to be an argument. Why are we breaking away? And he's trying to set the stage for a really robust political philosophy that is centered on independence. Now, in the next paragraph, he says, we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. He would later change that to self-evident. First, that all men are created equal and independent, that from that equal creation they derive rights inherent and inalienable, among which are the preservation of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Now he adds a semicolon here and moves on, that to secure these ends, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Another semicolon, which means he wants to separate this from what follows, that whenever any form of government shall become destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So let's look at this a little more closely. These sacred and undeniable truths men are created equal and independent. Now, what does he mean by equal? Does he mean that all have the same capacities and same abilities? No. The equality at which Jefferson is aiming is moral equality. Jefferson talks about all people roughly having the same capacity for moral sentiment, for sensing right or wrong action. And by virtue of that, he thinks all people are deserving of the same rights. Now, he certainly knows, it's morally founded, not based on any rational capacity, because he says in several letters that not all people are given the rational faculty to the same extent. There are very few Newtons, very few Galileos. Okay, because of the equality and dependence of all people, this is by nature, they derive rights inherent and inalienable, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Because that differs from Locke. Locke says pursuit of property. We have the rights to life, to liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now he goes on to start his political philosophy. It's grounded on a sort of philosophical, a couple philosophical axioms that are talking about what nature has given each human being. Given what nature has given each human being, governments are instituted to preserve those rights. And governments are fundamentally founded on the consent of the governed, on the vox populi in Latin, the voice of the majority of people. And then he goes on to say when governments do not do what they're supposed to do, when they do not protect the rights of the people are empowered to overthrow that government and institute a new government. Now he gives what I consider to be, I call a prudential caveat. And he says that prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. Okay, and he says humans are disposed to suffer before changing things. But, the idea is when the suffering becomes, when what they're suffering is insufferable, intolerable, right? When the abuses have been established over a long period of time, when the abuses are pointing towards the same end, and the abuses show no sign of stopping, then we have a right to overthrow government. But he cautions us that, of course, we need to be very, very chary here, because it's one thing to overthrow a government that's unjust. It's another to institute another government that's not any better. So we need to be very cautious about instituting the right sort of government. So a revolution here is a well-planned event. It's not something that is knee-jerk or spontaneous. It's something that's well-planned. And the idea is that you have a definite notion of the sort of government you want to have in place, and that's a government for and by the people. Now, Jefferson next goes to some, well, if you follow his semicolons and everything, you wind up getting 24 grievances aimed at King George, and the list is exhaustive, almost tiresomely so. The idea of exhaustion here is important because he's appealing to the tribunal of the world, and he wants to make sure that he has all the reasons here. But it winds up being a bit of overkill. Just to read a couple of these, I'm not going to go through all of them. You can do that on your own. George has dissolved representative houses repeatedly and continually for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of his people. He has suffered the administration of justice totally to cease in some of these colonies, refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. So we've got a police state going on here instead of a civil government. He has deprived us of the benefits of trial by jury. He has imposed taxes on us without our consent. And lastly, I'm going to read this one in its entirety. the 24th grievance is aimed at abolition of slavery. And Jefferson writes, he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred right of life and liberty in the person of a distant people who never offended him, i.e. the enslaved blacks, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, this opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men, and he capitalizes the word men, should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye, he is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us, and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them, and murdering the people upon whom he also obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. Now, I want to say something about this passage. Did not pass the Continental Congress, and for obvious reasons. It's not because the Congress was comprised nothing but racists. It's because we were at war. The United States was at war. The new nation was at war with Britain. And in that capacity, there was no time to debate the morality or the political expediency of slavery. It was something slaves were part and parcel of southern colonies. And it just wasn't the time to broach that issue, and it's something that would be in the offing in years to come. Members of the Congress knew that the issue of slavery would be abolished in due time. They just didn't know when, and they didn't quite know when to push the issue. Now, one thing needs notice here, and something I noticed when I read this rather carefully, is that it seems to me King George is endorsing, at least implicitly, the American Revolution. In advocating his advocacy of freedom for of the black slaves and asking them to rise up against the American colonists, he's implicitly arguing that, look, you are being treated as slaves, and anyone who's being treated as slaves has an opportunity to rise up against the oppressor and overthrow the yoke. And in doing that, he's implicitly endorsing the American Revolution, because the way there's a sort of slavery going on there. In the 24 grievances that Jefferson lists, we have a continued history of oppression against the American colonists, and in effect treating them as slaves. So if the blacks have a right to rise up in revolution against their slave owners, so too do the American colonists have a right to rise up against King George and his oppressive regime. So that's something. The second thing I'd like to look at is, when you look at all of the problems here, all of the grievances, this last grievance, placed last for emphasis, is 169 words. The next longest grievance is 52 words. Now, that suggests that eradication, abolition of slavery was very important to Thomas Jefferson. He puts it last after all these grievances, and then he expounds on it more than he does any of the other grievances. And he comes right out and blames King George, rightly or wrongly. I think certainly it's probably not correct to put all the blame, probably not putting all the blame on George, but he's putting a substantial amount of the blame on the king. He refused to use his negative, right? He could have vetoed and put an end to the transport of slaves to North America, and of course South America was practiced. Now, let's move on to the next section, which I call George's tyranny, George III's tyranny. He talks about, we petitioned for redress on countless times, and our petitions have been silent, have been not met with any sort of attention, and so forth. And he goes on to talk about how, the rights of the colonists have been neglected. I won't go into that, but the idea is it sort of follows up rather neatly with a lengthy paragraph on, why we have a right to revolt because of not paying attention to the colonists. Now, lastly, in the final paragraph, we have the dissolution statement, Jefferson's statement of dissolution. He says, "We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these states, reject and renounce all allegiance and subjection to the kings of Great Britain and all others who may hereafter claim by, through, or under them. We utterly dissolve and break off all political connection which may have hitherto subsisted between us and the people of Parliament of Great Britain. And finally, we do assert and declare these colonies to be free and independent states, and that as free and independent states they shall hereafter have power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish governments, and to do all other acts and things which independent states of right may do." And he ends with this powerful, powerful statement. "And for the support of this declaration, we mutually pledge our lives to each other, our lives and fortunes and our sacred honor." So the Declaration winds up being a very powerful argument, at least in Jefferson's draft and in the draft that passed through the Congress. The argument goes something like this: all people are created equal. People are social animals, so all people are endowed with certain rights: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, perhaps pursuit of property, and enable them to live peaceably among each other in a social setting. Now, Jefferson obviously doesn't mention property here because it bespeaks the issue of slavery once again. And he goes on to argue that governmental power is derived from the consent of the people. Okay, contentious claim at the time, no doubt. So it's the task of government to be responsible to the needs and the voice of the people. When the government fails to do so, right, the citizens have a right to abolish it and set up another government which is attentive to their voice. George, he argues, is certainly inattentive to the voice of the American colonists, so the colonists have a right to rise up in revolution. That's in gist what the Declaration is essaying to achieve, and I think it does so with tremendous and remarkable clarity. Now, the next question is were these sacred and undeniable truths so sacred and undeniable? The quick answer is probably not. Not everybody at the time believed that all people were equal. I think most people, and certainly if you appeal to the letters, the writings of Hamilton and the writings of Adams, you see that that they believed that there was an upper aristocracy where people were, through birth, through wealth, were just better than other people. And the Declaration was a document that was largely ignored. People celebrated the 4th of July for years after American independence, but they paid little attention to the Declaration of Independence for whatever reason. Most other countries did so too, with the exception of France. Now, it was in the 1810s, many decades after the writing and passing of the Declaration, that other countries started to pay attention to the Declaration. Venezuela forged its own declaration in 1811. The state of Texas, or the land of Texas, in 1836, formed the Declaration of Independence after its constant warring with Mexico. And we know today that there are over 100 countries that have a declaration, a document similar to the Declaration of the some 193 countries there are, I think. Okay. Now, what about freedom? What Jefferson was advocating is that we're all equal and free by nature. Those were radical claims. Let's take the notion of liberty. Many in Jefferson's day, expressly said that liberty was just a state of mind or state of being, not a right that is naturally guaranteed. Okay, it's something that you earned, you deserved. Native Americans were used as a great example because of their ferocity in war and their bravery. It was argued that Native Americans were free. Native Americans, unlike black slaves, many said, would prefer death. Many Native Americans would prefer death to the sort of thraldom that transported blacks would suffer. So Native Americans were free. I'll give you a couple quotes here. Here's Francois Furstenberg. Slavery did not result from conquest or misfortune, but from lack of virtue. It resulted from a choice to live in slavery rather than die in virtue. Slavery could be a well-deserved state of abject cowards. The Federalist Josiah Quincy writes, if the people of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts shall ever become slaves, it will be from choice and not from nature. It will be not because they have not the power to maintain their freedom, but because they are unworthy of it. I want to ask, what does this have to do with people, say, born into slavery? I mean, the argument would be, as silly as it might seem to us today, that, yeah, even if you're born into slavery, there's something you can do about it. You can die with dignity. You can die with virtue rather than continue to live as a slave. So all I'm trying to argue here is a lot of people at the time, Northerners and Southerners, as we got an example of a Northerner here, were not so sympathetic with the plight of enslaved Africans transported to the New World. Now, what Jefferson gives us in his Declaration tells us that this notion of liberty being something earned is much too narrow, right? It is something earned, but it's something you're born with. He gives us a revolutionary redefinition of the concept. It's something we're all entitled to at birth. Blacks, Asians, Native Americans, Europeans, and so forth. All people are deserving of liberty, right? So government must be so constituted that all people have opportunities, are born into freedom, and more than that, have opportunities to thrive in that freedom. So, we get the notion of government, of Republican government being constituted so as to preserve, its first duty is to preserve the rights of its citizens. Okay, now I'm going to do something a little bit strange. It may be strained. I want to evaluate the Declaration of Independence. Now, why did Jefferson write it? Well, on the five-man committee, John Adams had this to say about Jefferson's reputation as a writer. He says, Jefferson brought with him, he's talking about to the Congress, a reputation for literature, science, and a happy talent for composition. Writings of his were handed about remarkable for the peculiar felicity of expression. Adams has in mind, for example, Jefferson's summary review of the rights of British America, which Jefferson brought to the Congress in 1774 and was published probably without his consent, and earned him as a very young man of 31 instant celebrity. Now I want to talk the assessment of other scholars who have books on Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Carl Becker says, everything considered, the Declaration is brief, free of verbiage, a model of clear, concise, and simple statement. Alan Jane says, the Declaration offers a succinct heterodox theology and the epistemic views of Jefferson's early concept of democracy. Now, what he means by epistemic views, epistemology is a distinct philosophical term that deals with the possibility of human knowledge, so perhaps that word is a bit strained. Anyways, Danielle Allen writes, the Declaration is customarily thought of as an episode in the dramatic unfolding of the American Revolution. She's talking about the finished draft. She says, in 1,337 words, and I quote, the Declaration makes a coherent philosophical argument about political equality. And her focus in her book is about that political equality, so she's not really interested in getting at the gist of the Declaration, but she's interested in focusing on one aspect of the Declaration and its implications for us today. Now, what about the belletristic successes and failures of the Declaration? What I mean by that, looking at the Declaration as a document pursuant to the dictates of fine arts of Jefferson's day, was the Declaration a successful document? Now, when Jefferson wrote the Summary Review in 1774, he was young and brash, and the document didn't have much rhetorical polish. The document was bold, in your face, and he even lectures George III, the king, tells him how he ought to behave as a king. So you can see that, Jefferson at this time, in my estimation, is using hyperbole at times and being bold, and it's indicative of a young man's writing. And the document lacks polish, but it was a bold, in-your-face document. The Declaration was somewhat more constrained. It's in the manner of the prior document, but it's somewhat more constrained, more well thought out, and more reasonable, better argued, and so forth, and it has much more polish. But it's still a document that showcases the rather young Thomas Jefferson. Okay. Now, one thing we see is that he defines his audience and defines the purpose of the Declaration in the opening paragraph, the opening salvo, right? He tells us we're appealing to the whole world, to the tribunal of the world, to explain why we're emancipating ourselves from British yoke. So he defines his audience, he defines the intention of the document, right? The one thing I want to ask, and here's an interesting question, it was potentially a sublime document. And what do I mean by that? The aesthetics was a science in Jefferson's day that was blossoming and flourishing. And there's a lot of literature on understanding what was beautiful, not only in nature, but in human crafts, writing and oratory included, and what was sublime. The difference between beauty and sublime is this. Beauty was seen as colorful, small, fluent, elegant, unthreatening, and things like that. The sublime, so beautiful objects would be flowers and things unthreatening and beautiful like that. A nice, beautiful sculpture, a small figurine, something like that was crafted by humans neatly. The sublime would be something like Jefferson's Natural Bridge. It is a massive, rocky structure. And when you get on the top, as Jefferson did on several occasions, you get a violent headache. You feel like you might fall off. And you can see that it was the result of destructive forces over time in nature, and you have a sense of awe. So it often inspires awe or fear. It is solid. It is massive. Two rivers running together in a violent convulsion is another example. Gothic cathedral is an example. Now, the Declaration I assert here is potentially a sublime document because it focuses on a concept, liberty, which is bold and powerful, like other sublime things. Does Jefferson capture liberty in his thread of the document, the argumental thread of the document? Now, Hugh Blair, who wrote lectures on rhetoric and belle lettres in his day, defined, he said that sublime documents should not use sublime language. In other words, what he meant by that, if you're writing about something sublime, try not to use sublime language. Use language of excessive boldness and power and ferocity, because the document itself will be overwhelming and ineffective. The object itself bespeaks these things, bespeaks power and mass and force and so forth. You don't need to use concepts that exaggerate that. Just try to capture the sublimity by writing simply. And to do that, he says, a writer needs strength, clarity, concision, simplicity, and exactness. Does Jefferson capture the Declaration in those five capacities? Okay. It's a strong document, yes. It's not overdone with too many strong concepts. When Jefferson speaks of in the 24th transgression of George, and he talks about slavery, we get language that is a bit hyperbolic and overdone. And so in some instances, it's overly strong, and it's not, he's exaggerating. Clarity. The document, Jefferson's draft is essentially quite clear. Okay, we have the opening salvo. We can follow very, very easily the thread of the arguments. I would say he writes with unexampled clarity. Concision. Is the document concise? Not really. There are instances of redundancy. Again, in the 24th grievance, we find redundancy, and we see some hyperbolic language. So it's not as concise as it could be, but for the most part, he's not repeating himself, and he's not saying too much, and he's not going off on tangents. So by the aspect of concision, we say, yes, it's concise. Is it simple? Yeah, it's simple and it's clear. Again, the problem is the redundancies and the hyperboles in the 24th transgression. It's complex, wordy, it's redundant, and it could have been made more simple. Is it exact? Yes, it's exact. We can follow the thread of the argument rather easily. He says what he wants to say in such a manner that it's easily graspable by anyone who wishes to read the document. So the overall verdict, yes, Jefferson does succeed in crafting a document that meets the standards of Hugh Blair in his lectures for, writing effectively about a sublime document. So I think it's overall very, very effective. Now, why has the Declaration become, this is the last question I'm going to address and try to answer, why has it become so popular, given that it was neglected for many years after it was written? Well, part of it is that Jefferson clearly defines the purpose and the context of what he's writing about. And second reason is Jefferson winds up being successful in his purpose. And he says, look, I want to appeal to the tribunal of the world and see whether or not what we're doing is the right thing. And thinks, of course, we're doing the right thing. We're trying to establish a government for and by the people. And so to do that, if we're going to effect a revolution, we need to appeal to the people to justify that revolution. So he does beautifully capture the harmonizing sentiments of the day. Thirdly, the document was written by Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson had great felicity of expression with his pen. Imagine writing with a quill, dipping ink, and you're thinking about everything that you say before you write. You perhaps have an outline or several drafts, and it's not a matter of just punching in keys on a keyboard and coming up with composition and rewriting it. This had to be well thought out in advance. And you can imagine that he took several long walks in Philadelphia, probably at the night, in the cool of the night, to try to gather his thoughts and think about how to structure the work. Its structure for him was so overwhelmingly important. The Declaration succeeds immensely just in terms of its structure, that it's a well-structured essay. Another reason is because, and this is something Blair says as well, is look, to be an effective orator, to be an effective writer, someone who writes effectively concerning belle letters, one needs to write with authenticity. But that he means you need to believe in what you're writing. Jefferson could write with conviction, right? And that was the aim of the Declaration, conviction, convince people everywhere that what we were doing, the U.S. was doing was right. He believed, right, completely in the revolution and in liberty. His writings are infused with the concept of liberty and the notion that we're essentially by nature free people. So Jefferson believes in what he wrote, and that's a very powerful thing. The Declaration becomes, over time, it gets popular because people realize, well, it can be considered, as one historian said, kind of neatly, a birth certificate of the United States. And finally, it succeeds. And this is perhaps the most important reason it succeeds, is because it contains the germ of a political philosophy. There's a thread throughout that begins with the basic principles, the moral principles on which any political philosophy should be based: equality, liberty, certain rights. And it sort of outlines the sort of government that is best structured to meet those aims. So in that regard, I think the Declaration of Independence is that Jefferson drafted, and even the Declaration as it comes down to us that we have after the Continental Congress went through and roughly cut out about 33% of what Jefferson wrote. It's a tremendously effective document. And this 4th of July, I encourage those of you who listened to this, who enjoyed this document, to visit my webpage at www.mholowchak, that's MHOLOWCHAK.com, or email me at mholowchak@hotmail.com. And I encourage you to upload a copy of Jefferson's rough draft of the Declaration and read that. I think you'll be overwhelmed at the overwhelming sublimity of this document and the effective writing style of Thomas Jefferson. I want to thank you and hope you have a wonderful 4th of July holiday.